So everyone's talking about Daredevil being rebooted? And I understand why. Matt Murdock is proving that he's the best brick-catching lawyer around in No Way Home, and Daredevil and the rest of the Defenders have had a bump in popularity since switching over to Disney+. But now the big question is whether we'll get a season 4 of the beloved show or just a complete reboot. And what would those even look like now? Well, that's what I'm here today to discuss, so let's get started right now. Before really diving into what would make a worthy continuation of Daredevil, it's important to look back at what came before so we know what we're working with. Season 3 of the show ended with a brutal battle between Daredevil, Kingpin, and the future Bullseye in a Daredevil costume. After dabbling with the idea of eliminating Wilson Fisk for good, Matt was able to pull out of his tailspin and get back to his moral code. Instead of taking out Kingpin for good, he made a deal with him. Fisk would leave him and his friends alone because if Kingpin did retaliate, then Daredevil would make sure Kingpin's true love Vanessa was locked up forever or perhaps worse. So things ended with the promise of mutually assured destruction, and that counts as a win. And on top of that, public perception was changing. Fisk almost got away with convincing people that Daredevil was framing him and was actually a bad guy, but our heroes were able to turn that around as well.
Last night, Wilson Fisk tried to have me killed because I know the truth.
Plus, over on the civilian side of things, Foggy withdrew from his DA campaign and wanted to go back into business with Matt, helping those in need. They established a new practice called Nelson, Murdock, and Page, which of course included Karen Page as their investigator, since as Matt said, she's more stable than Jessica Jones, which, come on Matt, low blow. Anyways, we know this new practice is relatively successful as evidenced by Karen's appearance in the Punisher series, so all's well that ends well, right? Well, it wasn't all a happy ending. Even though Fisk was locked away, there was still the matter of Benjamin Poindexter, which, I'm sorry, I know is a comic book name, but that's still just so silly. Anyways, Poindexter got his spine shattered by Kingpin and ended the season in an experimental surgery that reinforced his broken body with the rare metal known as cogmium, setting him up to be a major antagonist for later. Only we never got a later because the show was canceled like all the other Netflix hero shows. But with all that out of the way and established, the question is, what comes next? So if we suddenly wake up tomorrow and Disney surprises us all by saying Daredevil is coming back, there's two big ways to do it. One would be a soft reboot. The other would be just saying screw it and making a 4th season of the show. Season 4 would probably be what fans want to see most, but admittedly it would be the most complicated. On one hand, you have to acknowledge the snap and all those consequences. But thinking about it, actually do you have to? It feels like every project in Phase 4 only skirts around the ramifications of the snap. Like sure, Falcon and the Winter Soldier was all about villains who liked the snap, but then I don't really remember anyone mentioning the snap in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Did everyone in that movie just stick around? Who knows? So working around the snap isn't impossible, but you would have to explain the whole Kingpin thing. Kingpin showed up in the Hawkeye show as sort of the same character, but also had some serious differences. And it still feels like the show was using the character, but still leaving enough ambiguity for someone later to decide if this was the same version of Kingpin as the Daredevil show. I mean, it probably wasn't, but wouldn't it be crazy if it somehow was? You'd have to explain how he got out of jail and why more people don't know about him, but again, not impossible if that's what they wanted to do. But also, if they did just want to make a season 4 of Daredevil, then there's a way to do it. We're in the multiverse era of the MCU, so why not take advantage of it? We can now establish that the Netflix Defender shows all took place in another universe to maintain continuity with the main timeline. In fact, that would probably be even better. The concept of the multiverse is going to be tough for some people to wrap their head around, so why not start with establishing that the Daredevil TV show and its past seasons were all in a different universe that we could visit from time to time. That helps everyone. And if it was in a different universe, then you could just pick up where we left off. Matt, Foggy, and Karen have established their practice and are helping the people of Hell's Kitchen. In that situation, it seems like Poindexter would assume his villainous Bullseye persona and cause trouble for our heroes, and Matt would continue his character arc he's been going through since the beginning. Now he has to work on what type of hero he wants to be. Thanks to Season 3, the public has sort of turned on Daredevil more than ever, and even with Fisk proven to be a liar, there's still going to be some lingering doubts and he has to work on if he wants the public to like him or not. But also, keep in mind that a good chunk of time has passed. Yes, season 4 could pick up right where we left off, but if the timeline is accurate, everyone's like 5 or 6 years older. Seeing how these characters grew off screen into what they are now would be fascinating, right? But one thing I will say right now, if there is a season 4 of Daredevil, don't make it 13 episodes. I think every Defenders show suffered from slow plot progression and filler, and it was entirely unnecessary. Make it 6 to 8 episodes and you got yourself something special. But now let's talk about the other side of things. Instead of Daredevil Season 4, we instead get the Daredevil soft reboot. I mean, it can't be a full reboot because Charlie Cox is clearly still the MCU's Daredevil, but there can be tweaks. And before you say no to this idea, remember that Thor also had his own soft reboot. He's almost a completely different character than he was in the first and second Thor movies. And it was only by leaning into the comedy angle of his character did it provide a fresh take on the God of Thunder that can now continue in a whole new set of Taika Waititi directed movies. Could they do something similar with Daredevil? Like, imagine if the Matt Murdock we saw helping Peter Parker out in No Way Home isn't the same one as we saw in the Netflix show and is just the version in our universe now. That way you could keep a lot of the same elements like Kingpin and Foggy and Karen, but explore them in a way that fits with the MCU's overall tone and story. I'm a little torn on which one I would prefer because as much as I would love just to continue with where we left off, I think it would be cool to explore new sides to all these characters. It would also provide a bit of a redo for some of Daredevil's biggest problems. I'm not saying that Daredevil needs to suddenly become a quip machine like Thor or anything, but sometimes I felt the Netflix era of shows were dark and gritty just for the sake of being dark and gritty. I want Daredevil and all the Defenders to be a darker corner of the MCU, but not at the cost of interesting storytelling. Which does bring me to my next point regarding a Daredevil Season 4 or a Daredevil soft reboot. The question is, can and should it be done without excessive violence and blood? The Daredevil Netflix show was definitely TVMA, with a lot of brutal things you wouldn't expect from a current MCU project, and whatever new version of the show comes next, you have to think that they would tone it down a lot in order to fit with the Disney brand. And is that okay? I mean, hey, I love watching Kingpin turn a guy's head into soup or watching Kingpin's flashbacks to the gruesome fate of his father as much as the next guy, but you could easily have those types of moments that have the same effect without the hardcore rating. Anyone who says that the Daredevil show needs to be excessively TVMA violent, because that's what it was before, is just plain wrong. As long as your characters are strong and relatable and likable, then it really doesn't matter the level of violence in your show. Just, make the show good. Like, look at Moon Knight, which yes has a darker tone than anything we've seen yet, but it's still undeniably an MCU project. If the Daredevil show can be similar enough to Moon Knight, then I think we'd be in good shape. And yes, while it would be great to see any type of return from Matt Murdock and his friends, I think the most exciting part of a potential new Daredevil project is seeing what other comic stories can be adapted now that the character is part of the MCU proper. And it could be fun to see what type of changes producers would make. Like, for example, most of Season 3 was a loose adaptation of the famed Born Again storyline, which saw Daredevil reach his lowest point as everything crumbles around him and his rivalry with Kingpin reaches its peak. Obviously, Season 3 wasn't a direct copy of that, and instead it got to do its own thing for most of it with pretty solid results. So what other stories are there? Well, something that could tie in with a soft reboot would be an adaptation of Daredevil Yellow. That comic arc had Daredevil write a letter to the deceased Karen Page that explains his early days of crime fighting and why he wore a yellow suit compared to his traditionally red one. It was basically a retelling of his origin, which would fit in well with what the MCU needs right now. And like the Born Again arc, it doesn't have to be a direct retelling. Maybe they could adapt it to have Daredevil in a yellow suit now as a symbol for his new character arc. Kinda like a fresh start. And hey, it would make sense. Daredevil specifically did not get his suit back at the end of Season 3 of Daredevil, which was fair, I guess, because when all the cops showed up, Poindexter, who was wearing the suit, was a crumpled sack of broken bones, and it probably would have been awkward for Daredevil to ask for the suit back at that point. But yes, the yellow suit in the comics symbolizes Daredevil's origin, so having that be the suit he's now wearing for the MCU makes sense. And if rumors are to be believed, Matt Murdock may show up in the She-Hulk show wearing the yellow suit, so who knows? I think Kingpin deserves his own section, don't you? because the question becomes, if Daredevil is brought back, how much should Kingpin be a part of it? Like, Season 3 really put a cap on the Daredevil-Fisk rivalry and seemed to open the door to new threats. But like, Vincent D'Onofrio is just too good as Kingpin to not keep him around. Well, maybe this is where the MCU version of Fisk can come into play. If we operate under the idea that the Kingpin in Hawkeye is different from the Kingpin in Daredevil, then that opens up a lot more story possibilities. This new Kingpin seems like he operates enough in the shadows where the average person doesn't know about him, but is still powerful enough to make heroes like Hawkeye want to avoid fighting him. Because he's pretty intimidating and also maybe has super strength and invulnerability? I don't know, he was taking arrows like a champ in that final episode. But maybe with Echo getting her own spin-off show where Kingpin is most likely the main villain, Daredevil could co-star in that show since the two have such an intense comic history. But hopefully we get to see Kingpin wear more Hawaiian shirts and get hit by more cars. That'd be fun. But am I thinking too small by just putting Daredevil against villains like Kingpin and Bullseye again? I mean, surely Daredevil has a whole rogues gallery that could be explored, right? Well, kind of. I would say arguably the biggest villain he hasn't faced personally is Typhoid Mary, but that's because she was busy over on the Iron Fist TV show played by Alice Eve. There, her powers were changed though, from originally having telekinesis to now just being a master of weaponry. Kind of weird that the most mystical show in the Defenders didn't want to give Mary powers, but whatever. In a Season 4 soft reboot of Daredevil, maybe they could bring in a more comic accurate version of the character and introduce her complicated relationship with Daredevil. You could also introduce characters like Mr. Fear or Ikari into the mix for a really good time. What do you think? Or, what if the MCU gets really crazy and just makes Daredevil Season 4 the setup for a full-on Midnight Suns event series? Is that too much wishful thinking? Maybe, but consider it. Oscar Isaac recently gave an interview for Moon Knight where he name-dropped the Midnight Suns and talked about teaming up with Punisher, Ghost Rider, Blade, and Daredevil. And it's interesting because Isaac has said he knew nothing about Moon Knight before getting cast, and some fans are pointing to this as proof that a Midnight Suns type of team is in the works because Isaac wouldn't know the name otherwise. And that's interesting, especially because Daredevil and Punisher aren't usually members of this team. Maybe it would be a hybrid of all the gritty heroes working together. Either way, that would be amazing because seeing heroes like Moon Knight and Blade interacting with Daredevil would be a treat to see and do wonders in building out the dark corners of the MCU like the Netflix series tried to do. But I guess I have to mention the other Defenders in all of this. If Daredevil does come back and get another season, what does that mean for everyone else? Like, Jessica Jones and Luke Cage were very well received, so what do? Recasting them and not Matt Murdock feels wrong, doesn't it? Would bringing in different universe versions of those two characters played by the same actors be confusing? Or should the MCU just not touch them at all? But then if that's the case, then you're letting powerful, interesting, and complex characters sit on the shelf while Matt Murdock gets to run around with his new pals Moon Knight and Blade. That doesn't sound fair, right? Jessica Jones and Luke Cage deserve to be brought back. Iron Fist, on the other hand, actually strike everything I said, because if they bring back 3 out of 4 Defenders, then it's just weird if they don't bring back Danny Rand, and nobody wants that. Actually, yeah, just keep Jessica Jones and Luke Cage the same, but completely revamp Iron Fist to make him overall better as a way to show that the MCU versions of the characters are better than ever. I don't want to say never mention Iron Fist again, but I'm not saying it. Man, his show was terrible. But you know one of the best things about bringing Daredevil back in the MCU in any capacity? You now have the opportunity to bring in more established MCU characters to bounce off of. Like, remember how the Hawkeye show featured Yelena in a scene-stealing role that also helped further the plot? Well, something like that could totally happen in Daredevil Season 4. First off, why couldn't it be Yelena again? Yelena is the breakout star of Phase 4 so far, and I just want to see her in everything. Plus, she fits with Daredevil's darker vibe if she wanted to. Maybe she loved her first trip to New York so much that she's back and comes across Daredevil in her anti-Black Widow brainwashing mission. So Yelena is a strong contender, but who else could make a surprise appearance in a Daredevil Season 4 show that could connect things to the larger MCU? Well, on the TV side, Moon Knight and She-Hulk both fit as they seem to operate in the same circles. Anyone else? How about a surprise J. Jonah Jameson appearance? I'd like to see what someone like him would do in Daredevil's world. All this talk about how to continue Daredevil's television story, but I've been ignoring the bigger picture. Could season 4 of Daredevil set up a Daredevil movie? Maybe not totally, but I could see a team-up movie in the character's future. The whole point of Spider-Man No Way Home was about bringing Peter back down to a street-level hero, and now that he's operating on lower stakes, why couldn't Peter and Daredevil team up in the next Spidey film? Think about it, they share a ton of the same villains in the comics like Mysterio, Electro, and of course, Kingpin, and what better way of having Peter really embrace the street-level crime of New York than teaming him up with the Devil of Hell's Kitchen to take down the powerful Kingpin? Sounds like an awesome 4th movie in the Spidey franchise, right? Well, it all starts with Daredevil Season 4. Hey, who knows, maybe if Daredevil comes back, then there's hope for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Cloak and Dagger, and Runaways, and Inhumans. On second thought, let's just bring back Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and leave it at that.